Well, thank you and welcome, everybody. As Christy mentioned, this is the 7th Planning Innovations Forum and our second on SB 743 implementation. The first one was held just over a year ago and was called Moving from LOS to VMT, Making SB 743 an Asset to Your Community. And at this forum, our panelists provided some guidance on how your city can start making the shift to VMT. And as Christy mentioned, we also heard a lot of concerns and questions about the fee and how to exact a transportation impact fee with the updated CEQA guidelines. So today's forum is an attempt to address these questions with help from the cities of Oakland, San Francisco, and San Jose. And these cities will be talking about how and why they are either considering replacing or they have already replaced the previous fee structure with one that can fund multimodal improvements, can reduce VMT, and are aligned with their city's sustainability goals as well as the goals of SB 743. Now, as a brief reminder, the goals of SB 743 are to update current transportation impact analysis under CEQA. And this is to more appropriately balance the needs and address the congestion management issues that we have with the regional and statewide goals related to infill development and our sustainable community strategies. They also address public health with the promotion of active transportation, as well as our greenhouse gas reduction state targets. As you know, also the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, OPR, recommended VMT as the measure for transportation impact analysis under CEQA, and this shift to VMT means that impacts will not need to be mitigated only for auto delay, but also for other modes, including public transit, cycling, walking, and whatever else might be emerging in the next few years. Also, as an update to SB 743, it's anticipated that the California Natural Resources Agency will adopt the regulatory changes to CEQA late this summer, based on OPR's proposed updates to CEQA guidelines that was released in November 2017. Now, once it's adopted, the new CEQA guidelines will go into full effect January 1st, 2020. Also, OPR released a revised technical advisory this past April, and it provides some recommendations on how to consider VMT and also the significance thresholds. So in addition to the technical advisory, we're also lucky in the Bay Area to have a number of cities who are early adopters of VMT for transportation impact analysis. So as we mentioned here, Oakland, San Francisco, and San Jose have all shifted to VMT. And Concord, Fremont, and Hayward are also starting or have just initiated the process. Elsewhere in the state, San Diego, Los Angeles, and Sacramento are just about to finalize their shift over to VMT. And of course, Pasadena was the first city in the state to evaluate traffic impacts according to VMT. Now, in addition to all these efforts, MTC ABAG, along with other big MPOs, plus a few state agencies, have been engaged in case study work to determine the cost and feasibility of mitigating transportation impacts using VMT outside of the transit priority areas. And part of this effort is an exploration of VMT mitigation strategies and exchanges, so basically like a VMT cap and trade. And I just want to put in a short plug for a workshop that's going to be exploring this concept further. It's going to be next week, June 15th, in San Jose. And I have flyers on this, so if you're interested, please see me during the break. And then lastly, we're going to be conducting an assessment of all our technical assistance programs, and would like to hear from you about what your needs are for SB 743 implementation. And this will help us better understand what we need to consider for the entire assessment. So you'll find a survey on your chair as you came in, and thank you in advance for providing us your thoughts. Okay, so now back to the fee and the forum. So our first panel will provide an overview of the approaches that they've taken to moving to VMT. San Jose recently adopted VMT and is now considering a fee to complement the shift. And for both Oakland and San Francisco, the fee is one component of a multi-pronged approach that includes the shift to VMT as well as a TDM ordinance. And they will each be providing an overview of the benefit and the purpose of this approach. Our second panel will do a deeper dive into the fee and and how to approach the technical analysis of the maximum justified fee. They will also show us how to determine the right fee structure as to not impair the development feasibility, and then also consider the legal issues for this more multimodal and flexible approach. I do want to note that although the fee is not required as part of SB 743 implementation, thinking about it and how to coordinate the fee with the updated CEQA guidelines can provide your city the flexibility to mitigate the impact of the development on the entire transportation system. And this can allow your city to be more in line with changing travel preferences, emerging technologies, and then also your climate goals. So now, without further ado, I will introduce the first panel. We will first hear from Ramses Madhu, who is the Transportation Planning Manager for the City of San Jose's Department of Transportation. Before joining the DOT, he was the Associate Director of Parking and Transportation for Stanford University. And his work in both places focuses on how to bring out the institutional, infrastructural, and behavior change needed to create non-car dependent cities. Then we'll hear from Darren Renoletti, who is the Policy Director for Housing Security in the Oakland Mayor's Office. In this role, he advises Mayor Schaaf on citywide housing policy issues. Previously, he worked in the city's Planning and Building Department, most recently as the Deputy Director for Planning, where he oversaw all land use and planning functions, including development review and long-range planning, and served as the city's environmental review officer. And last but not least, we'll hear from Wade Whitgreff, who is a principal planner and a transportation team manager at the San Francisco Planning Department. He leads policy efforts that align good public policy with environmental review. And prior to joining as a planning, he worked as an environmental consultant for Winsler and Kelsey, which is now GHD. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ramses. And you can stand or?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Ramses Madhu from City of San Jose. We recently passed our ordinance to go towards VMT. We passed it in February, went into effect in March. We just had a 30-day turnover, went right into it. Still have some projects going under both old rules and new rules. Let's see. So I'm going to go through a little bit of where we started, because I think that the context of your city just matters so much to understanding how this is going to work for you, how you can kind of bring it into your city versus others. Talk a little bit about how broad this is in terms of city functions. It is really, truly a recrafting of the lens through which development review works and transportation planning, and to a large degree land use planning changes as well. So really understanding how broad this is across the city's departments is really important. Talk about the actions that we actually took in the city, and then talk a little bit about our next steps and kind of how we see this going forward from there. All right, so City of San Jose, we're a city of about 1 million people, 180 square miles. We're roughly half of Santa Clara County in both population and land mass. And we're incredibly diverse in our land uses, right? We have stables and horses running in certain parts of our city to moderately urbanized areas and a lot of suburb-like development. So why did we decide to take on this pretty intense and difficult task of changing this policy before everybody else did, when we could just kind of borrow and move forward with what was given? Well, one, our general plan pretty much actually tells us to do this, right? A VMT was actually incorporated in our general plan quite a bit and it was updated in 2011. And after the recession, we really weren't able to kind of change our processes to meet that. As I came, it's actually one of the reasons I took this job with the city about a year and a half ago was because of this. This policy environment is actually quite nice in the general plan and supports this. As well as a lot of the strategies in our general plan, our focused growth strategy, we're really trying to focus most of the growth in about 17% of the land. And to be able to do that, you pretty much need to move away from LOS because those developments were ending up having to spend more to mitigate what they needed to do. And so in a certain way, our general plan was like a poster child for this policy. So we really had a lot of motivation from the top and all over to do this, which gave us a lot of runway, a lot of leeway to challenge what was going on. We had an old transportation impact policy, really focused on LOS, of course, but it had some multimodalism. It didn't have a lot of teeth in it yet, but it did have some interesting things. We had a protected intersection policy that allowed us to pretty much do away with LOS and fund multimodal infrastructure improvements in the area of the intersection that would have had to do LOS improvements. So we had a little bit of motion towards multimodalism, but the lens was still very much auto-focused in LOS. And then some other really important things, some cities do this and some don't. We used CEQA. We really, really rode the horse of CEQA to get transportation improvements. Getting rid of LOS was very scary for most of the folks who actually manage the investment and change in the transportation system because this was our primary lever. And so kind of getting everybody to understand, this is going to be okay was like maybe half the work, right? And then the CMP. Right, our congestion management program is pretty important to us in Santa Clara County. It's a way that all of us cities kind of talk together and understand our system together. And there's a lot of metrics that are coming out of that, including the legal requirement for CMPs to measure most of their facilities through LOS, right? And so kind of figuring out, there's a clash there. There's a direct clash right now in state law between the CMP legislation and this new CEQA update. I'll talk a little bit about that as I go on. All right, so this is the list of departments that actually showed up almost every single week for 2 hours for 9 months for a meeting, which myself and my boss led, and we had to hash out an immense amount of detail. Hopefully we've done a lot of weed whacking along with my friends here so that you guys can borrow from it. But it really is a citywide change, at least it was for us, in terms of how everybody kind of gets from CEQA and understands how transportation plays a role in their part of the city. So it's a long list, and everybody had to spend a good amount of time on this. And so I think a lot of people who talk about SB 743 change, if your development policy is enshrined in your general plan or anything like that, there's a lot of work to be done to unwind what you used to do, and it's really broad across your city. All right. So what do we actually do? These are the 6 things that we actually kind of had to produce or put together to make this policy come about in the legal structures of our city and the operations, right? So the council actions that we ended up taking, we had quite a lot of general plan text amendments. The way that we've used the general plan in San Jose, one did already motivate VMT, as I started off with, but we've also used this funny thing where we pretty much enshrined the old transportation analysis policy as a little mini version of it in it. And so we had to kind of extricate that and all the references to it throughout the document and then kind of replace them with references to the new one, and we wanted to do that because of the kind of stick that creates legally. So when developers come to the council and say, "Hey, why the hell are your staff beating us down with these crazy multimodal improvements?" Council can't kind of say, "Oh well, they're just making this up." It's in the general plan, right? The policy itself, of course, went through, I think, at least 20 drafts, and I'm not exaggerating. We did it all on Google Docs to make the version management a little more comfortable, but it was a lot of work. Another thing that's really interesting that hasn't been kind of surfaced for a lot of folks is we also adopted infill opportunity zones. And this is a legal mechanism that was revived by SB 743, was sunsetted, I believe, almost a decade ago. San Francisco was the only one to use it in its prior life. And what this allows jurisdictions to do is designate certain areas that meet certain density and transit and other requirements, to designate the CMP facilities, those intersections and potentially other facilities that are there, to be removed from the CMP LOS requirements. I'm starting to get way down the technical hole there, but this is one way where SB 743 did think far enough ahead about this clash between the CMP legislation and this new CEQA legislation, and allow us as jurisdictions to kind of try to weave them in and make them a little more whole. Doesn't allow you to get totally out of that CMP relationship to LOS, which is still frustrating. But it allows us in exactly the places where we want to see that infill development, where there is good transit support. You can use this to do that. And we, at this point, until VTA unrolls its next network, I think we reduced our intersections by roughly 30 or so out of 112, something like that. And that will increase to about 60 once VTA's next network plays out. So there's a relationship to the transit and services and stuff like that. And then the last thing we did, we believe in agile management in DOT. We really believe in iteration. We don't believe you're going to get the policy right in the first place, especially when you're trying to kind of lead the way a little bit. And so we made sure that there was a return to council within a couple years once the kind of region, and particularly our CMP partners, come to the table and kind of figure out what they're going to do with this, that we go back and say, all right, what have we learned through the process so far, and what has the rest of our cohort kind of said? How are we going to change it to make sure we align? Now, on the staff level, to make things easier for us, and also to kind of live up to the promise of SB 743, which part of it is a CEQA streamlining process, right? And the law kind of challenged us as not only to change from LOS to VMT, but how do we actually make the CEQA process that is awful in so many ways in terms of just analysis and process and paperwork and staff time and consultants, how do we make it better, right? So we developed a VMT estimation tool, similar, maybe you've seen the Green Trips tool from Transform. That was one of our inspirations. San Francisco's TDM tool was another one of our inspirations. And we really we spent a lot of time and money developing a broad research basis for this. And to me, this is one of the most important things we did, and one of the most important ways to kind of figure out how we all, as at least a county, but potentially a region, start talking about what this means to us. There's a lot of funny, interesting legal issues that come up with this. Specifically, all of us are supposed to use the regional baseline, which should be the same for all of us. But a lot of us have different models. And we have, or even if we have the same model, we have different specifications within them that cause us to have different baselines. And this is actually going to be an issue over time, and we're probably going to end up having to adjudicate this if we don't kind of take proactive action in terms of kind of figuring out what it is to talk to each other over this. And then, of course, our transportation analysis guidelines were updated wholesale, actually, this time, which was really great. I'm fortunate to have an incredible staff. Wilson Tam on my team pretty much wrote a master's thesis of a new book, right? 100+ pages of technical guidelines for doing all of this. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the policy itself that we passed. All right, so of course, yes, we went from LOS to VMT for CEQA. Now, I think it's important to mention we didn't get rid of LOS altogether, against my liking, but to kind of bring the city along and the public along, we left LOS in a much reduced fashion in terms of the geographic scope and the scenarios that we had to study under the police power, so just in kind of the city's version of just operations analysis in effect. But to get to the VMT portion, all right, so we followed most of OPR's guidelines. We put in screening criteria We used most of their screening criteria. We found we kind of hybridized two of them, the low VMT and the kind of high transit area screenings. We kind of put an and between them and stacked them on top of each other. Yeah, let's see, what else we did. Right, and so then projects that don't meet that screening criteria then need to analyze their VMT, and if there's actually an impact, they need to mitigate, right? One of the things we did do for the interim period is say to our neighbors, look, this is a hard process, you're not there yet, let's not fight, we're going to follow your rules in your city until you guys adopt, or the state kind of comes down and says, you know, January 1st, 2020, that's it, and then we're all going to go to VMT. So kind of trying to play good neighbor with that. And one of the other things that's that's very San Jose specific is the way that we're dealing with projects that do have significant VMT impacts. Ooh, okay. We have a process for dealing with how those projects are going to pay into larger, broad VMT mitigations, but we're hoping that will be replaced by larger regional TIFs. I'm going to quickly jump to the next one because I got about a minute left. Yeah, okay. Two things. So what's our next big things we're going to do, right? So we're going to look at what we learned from our initial implementation of this and understand what we learned from the county process. But one of the things that we're really seeing immediately through our research is that there's a real lack of knowledge in terms of mitigations. There's a decent amount of research in TDM, but TDM is a Band-Aid for a problem, which is not enough infrastructure, right? And I'm quite worried about too much effort and money going into TDM and not actually building out the infrastructure so people can actually get around without a car, instead of trying to kind of coax people into living some lifestyle that's somewhat not really supported, right? And in San Jose, that is particularly the case. And I used to run a large TDM operation. I love TDM, but I have to say it's still a Band-Aid, right? We need the trains, we need the transit, we need the bike lanes before we can push people into using them, right? Let's see. Okay, I got about 30 seconds left. What else is worth really covering? Let's see, let's go here. That's our VMT estimation tool. It's worth downloading from our website. It's very, very articulated, and what I mean by that is every single assumption, mathematical equation, paper that an assumption was based on is all exposed. You can look into and see why a certain action is supposed to result in a certain type of mitigation. And the reason we wanted to do this is because it's such a new element in the field that we wanted to really push up and say, hey, question us, we're all doing this together. We know we're going to end up in court, but okay, you know, we're hoping that this actually gives us a little buffer in court by saying, look, this isn't, there's no black box here. Everything is exposed. Yeah, so and if you ever have questions about that, please reach out. And last slide here. Yeah, so we have the VTA process going on, countywide process. That research and development is really important. As we get into this, I think we're having trouble really saying, hey, you project coming in, you're going to build a $100 million project. We really need you to build some real infrastructure. And they're like, all right, show us the nexus. And the nexus just isn't really built out yet to get good infrastructure out of this yet. So really push that. Phase 2 I talked about, that's going to be our refinement. And then TIFs, and we're not there yet. So I'm really excited to hear what these guys have to say and what the rest of this event has to say about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Darren Ranaletti, and I work at the City of Oakland. I'm a recovering planner. I worked in the Planning and Building Department for 15 years, helping to solve this disconnect between transportation and land use planning. Now I'm working in the mayor's office, hoping to solve the housing crisis. So the plan is, in a few years, we'll come back here, and I'll give you the story about how Oakland solved the housing crisis. I'm going to tell you a story about the Oakland Transportation Land Use Strategy. Unfortunately, it's an unpublished book, so you're only going to hear it from me. I'm really happy to be here to tell you it, and I'm happy I get to go ahead of San Francisco, who really is the leader in all of this, regionally and nationally. So thank you, San Francisco, for your leadership. We stole a lot from them, and we're hoping that you'll steal a lot from us. This book is really exciting to people like me who are transportation and land use geeks, but it also has another benefit. If you have a toddler at home who's not going to bed, read this book and they'll be totally out. So the story starts with the vision. And here's the vision. 1998, the city updates its general plan, the land use and transportation element. And it was a new day. The 1990s, right? We've got new urbanism, smart growth, urban design, transit-oriented development. We even had a Congress prepare this general plan. So if a Congress prepares a general plan, I mean, it's serious, right? And it gets implemented right away. Well, here's the bad news. That was 1998. So 2018, so this is 20 years to implement this vision. So paradigm shifts take a while. But you've got to be persistent, and you've got to be, there has to be a strategy. And the goal of that plan was to integrate transportation and land use planning, focus on transit-oriented development, direct housing and other development along the corridors, and to promote alternative transportation options. Chapter 2 takes more than a vision. We adopted that in 1998, and yet this is what we got. So this is today, downtown Oakland, 17th Street. So how come we didn't get from that to this? This is what we want, and this was the vision in 1998. Well, how come we weren't getting that? And it's because, although we had the vision, our policies and practices weren't aligned to achieve that vision. So we had a development review process that was totally out of whack with this vision. We were doing CEQA transportation analysis that was based on LOS. As you know, that results in mitigations that are automobile focused, adding lanes, adding capacity. We also had out-of-date parking requirements from 1965. So we were building too much parking, we were generating a lot of traffic. So our whole system was designed for cars. And yet, even if cars disappeared and CEQA disappeared, development still has impacts, right? So if those went away and we had development, we still need, as Ramses put it so well, we need a way to get the trains, to get the transit. We still need a functioning transportation system. And in today's structure, we've got to ask development to pitch in, because we are all in it together. And in Oakland, we ask the developers to pitch in, but we also have the public stepping up, and I'll get to where in a moment. We had some bonds that also funded transportation, so you need both of those things together. So we knew what the problem was, we knew what the vision was, so here's the strategy. This is when the book starts getting good. So we needed the policies, and I call these the bridge policies. So you've got the big guiding vision, and then you've got your work day-to-day that the staff is doing. But there's a real need for those in-between or interim policies, and they do a couple things. They frame what you're doing in larger contexts. So, our strategy is about having complete streets. It's also about solving global warming. It's in our energy and climate action plan to switch from LOS to VMT. It's also in our housing element to say we need to do this so that we can provide housing. So it starts building the case, and then later when you're actually doing the work, you can cite these policies. So here's the big graphic, the four-legged stool, although the four-legged stool can be a little wobbly sometimes, so it's the prongs, as Skruti said, are the four pillars. And these all work together. So this was a strategy. And they all support each other. They don't all have to be together, but they all support each other. So we've got CEQA reform to replace LOS with VMT. We've got transportation demand management, Tdm requirements. We've got revised parking requirements, and then we have a transportation impact fee. And how did we do all of that? The most exciting chapter. All right, so with CEQA reform, this was in 2016. We applied for and got a staffing assistance or technical assistance grant from MTC ABAG. Thank you very much for that. We love those grants. If you don't do those grants, you're totally missing out. Much of this strategy was funded by that PDA planning program. So we hired Nelson Nygaard, fantastic, to help us with this effort. We actually did a lot of public outreach. We went out to the public and tried to explain this LOS VMT thing. And that we found was key. So in the end, when we switched, we didn't get a lot of public pushback because the community was aware of what we were doing. We replaced LOS with VMT for CEQA purposes. We developed a whole new set of guidelines. So our CEQA analysis in transportation is really small now because pretty much everything in Oakland is less than significant impact under VMT. But we still got to analyze the project. And so now our guidelines are big, big, big non-CEQA analysis, circulation, site design, ped and bike safety. You know, we've got to do planning again. We were lazy as planners because we were relying upon CEQA to do our planning. Now we get to plan rather than rely upon CEQA. And that was approved by the Planning Commission. Next up, we have our Tdm requirements. It was part of the previous effort, so it was done together with the switch to VMT. And this really addresses a project individual impact. So there are a whole range of strategies that a project can do. There's some mandatory strategies, and then there's some options. So you get, like, you have to do this, and here's the menu of things that you get to pick. And we apply it through project conditions of approval. So one thing that differentiates us in San Francisco and I guess San Jose is we're smaller, we're a little more nimble. We don't take a lot of stuff to the city council. We don't adopt a lot of ordinances. So we don't have a TDM ordinance. We wanted the ability to update that on our own. Things can get a little political when you go to a board of supervisors or a city council. So we believe the nexus is there, and so we do it through conditions of approval. We updated our parking requirements. Also, PDA planning grant from MTC ABAG. We did a parking survey that actually looked at what the parking demand and utilization in Oakland was for residential parking. That gave us some good data. We went out to the public, explained that to them. So now we have a whole new set of parking requirements. No minimum requirements in downtown. We replaced those with maximums. And then along our corridors, we have greatly reduced parking minimums with the ability to go even less if you provide things like transit passes, car share spaces, and unbundled parking. Those were adopted by the city council because it's in our zoning regulations. And then finally, we've got the transportation impact fee. We had a fantastic Nexus consultant who's here today, Bob Spencer, that you'll get to hear from on panel 2. We also had an economic feasibility consultant that looked at financial feasibility of the fee and development in Oakland. And then we had a stakeholder working group, which was comprised of a lot of different folks inside the city, outside the city, different stakeholders, developers, nonprofit developers, housing advocates. We also adopted the fee at the same time that we adopted an affordable housing fee and a capital improvements fee. So we were trying to figure out what type of fee would be financially feasible and then how to divide up that pie. So at the table in the stakeholder working group, we also had Friends of the Library, park supporters, and it was a whole dialogue. And in the end, the bulk of the fee went to affordable housing, but there was some that, a meaningful amount that went to transportation impacts. And that covers the project's impacts as far as cumulative impacts. So when we're reviewing a project now, CEQA analysis, very, very small. TDM requirements, they pay the fee, and that addresses their cumulative impacts. And those fee revenue is then used to enhance our transportation system. It's very broadly structured. It's very flexible. It can be used for capital improvements, bike-related, ped-related. It can't be used for operations, so it couldn't fund bus service, for example. But it's broadly structured to enhance our transportation system. So what does that mean for today? Getting to the end of the book. We think it's working. We've streamlined the CEQA process. A project that used to linger for 2 years in the CEQA process now takes about 6 months. This is for a major project. We've also done a lot of tiering off of specific plans that we've done, so that's another tool that I'm not going into detail here, but That's another tool that we've used. And when we're reviewing projects, the development impact review is really focused on good projects, not just mitigating bad stuff, but getting good stuff. We offset the impact via the fee and Tdm, like I mentioned. A lot less parking spaces are being constructed, so we've got less parking and trips being generated. We've got more infill development and more housing. So in Oakland now there's over 6,000 housing units under construction, the most in decades. Because of all that supply, rents have stabilized in Oakland. We've got a long way to go to make Oakland more affordable, but they have stabilized, so we've stopped the bleeding momentarily while we continue to work on our housing system. And we've got a much better transportation system, and as I mentioned before, in 2016, the Oakland voters generously adopted Measure KK, which was an infrastructure bond. So now we've got the developers pitching in, we've got the public pitching in, and we can deliver now a transportation system that helps realize this vision. So there's a few things we're still trying to figure out. It is a bit of a learning curve because this is a new paradigm. We actually have to think and plan and not just rely upon CEQA. So it's new, it's different. When we're doing a transportation analysis, I think there's more work up front now. What's going to be studied? What's the scope? We still work a lot with transportation consultants that come in and study projects for us, so that still exists. And then monitoring TDM measures is difficult. I think you probably all know that, and this isn't new, but now that we're relying more on TDM, I think that we're going to learn a lot about how to monitor and enforce operational requirements from a TDM perspective. And then the last thing, this is really interesting. I'd be happy to talk about it in Q&A, but now that we've shifted, we've got still a lot of old stuff in the closet. So we've got these old projects that were approved with LOS mitigations. And maybe the developer doesn't want to do the mitigation, we don't want the mitigation, and so what do you do about those? So we've come up with a system to try to rectify that issue. So that's the end of the story. And looking back, there's a few things I wanted to share with you. And these are our tips. I mentioned those in-between or bridge policies. Those are good. So you've got your foundational documents and then your actual legislation or practices. In the middle, it's good to adopt, whatever policy you're working on. Put something in there about all this stuff so that it can help support it later on. Technical assistance grants are great. You might be a small city or working for a small city or know a small city that says, oh, well, this is the big three. We can never do this. Well, you can. There's a lot of assistance out there. Steal from us and get technical assistance to do it. Community engagement. I think this often isn't discussed much in these kinds of forums, but we found that it was helpful because a lot of this stuff is kind of envelope pushing and you're going to get a lot of pushback. So another reaction to, well, the big three did it, but we can't do it in our little city because we don't have the same kind of culture or values. Well, you probably do. You just need to get out and you need to talk to folks and you need to find your advocates and supporters and build that. And then learn from us, steal from us. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. My name is Wade Wickraff. I'm a transportation team manager at San Francisco Planning. Thank you, Kruti and Christy, for inviting me here. And also, thank you to the next panel. They actually shaped what I'm going to talk about a lot, as well as numerous agencies in San Francisco. And this is because we had been exploring removing automobile delay for about 10 years prior to SB 743. When it did pass, we moved relatively quickly, and I'm going to give a brief overview of what we did, focusing on our impact fee, and then explain our approach's applicability elsewhere / lessons learned. This story is going to sound very similar to what you just heard, but maybe with a slightly different narrator. So first, though, some context. We are growing. This growth creates constraints on our transportation systems.
we physically cannot add more capacity to our roadway networks. Even if we wanted to, or could, I should say, it would not align with our Transit First policy, Vision Zero safety goals, or greenhouse gas reduction targets. So a question we often ask ourselves is, how do we keep people moving as our city grows? And we try to take a somewhat comprehensive approach to answering that question through long-range planning, capital planning, operational planning, demand management, other types of things, but we realized we needed to do more. So that led us to the creation of the Transportation Sustainability Program. Just like Oakland, each component of this three-part program was legislated separately, but each built momentum off of each other and was tied together through reducing vehicle miles traveled from growth. So I'm going to focus on the first component, invest, but then make connections with the other two. Many cities are facing funding shortfalls for transportation. San Francisco is certainly no different. In 2013, our then late Mayor Ed Lee comprised a task force to define funding needs for transportation. And at that time, it was identified as $10 billion. Of that amount, we had three buckets: existing sources, new sources, and then unfunded amounts. Revenues allocated through the task force were focused on maintaining the core system and making capital improvements to enhance operational efficiency. In the task force, it was recognized that new development needed to pay more of their fair share for their impacts, and so this is where Invest comes in. Invest updated a prior impact fee. Those fee rates are shown here and apply to non-residential development first in the 1980s, starting downtown, and then slowly expanded over the years to the rest of the city. The adopted fee, which became effective in November 2015, was based on the estimated number of motorized trips from development. It applied to residential development for the first time and updated the prior non-residential fee. The fee rates were set at amounts below the nexus, but at an amount deemed economically feasible, so not to prohibit development from occurring, similar to what Oakland talked about. We conducted a feasibility study, and that will be updated every 3 years, and we would potentially update our fee rates to reflect that feasibility study. Our next panelists are going to cover all these details a lot more, so I'm going to move on from that. The fee will be spent on local and regional transit infrastructure and local streetscape improvements. So each of these expenditures reduce vehicle miles traveled. But now we had more money for these projects, but these projects could get bogged down in years of environmental review. This is because they are intended to increase person throughput capacity, but could result in a decrease in automobile capacity. Likewise, housing projects could get bogged down in doing automobile delay analysis in environmentally friendly locations. So we decided to remove automobile delay in CEQA. We relied on years of outreach and substantial evidence that we had created, as well as the state. And in March 2016, our San Francisco Planning Commission adopted a resolution that removed it and then replaced it with VMT as a significance criterion. It aligned, you'll hear that word a lot, it aligned our transportation review with our adopted policies. This change, as we know, meant that transportation projects that induce VMT are going to result in impacts. Conversely, projects that reduce it will not. For land use projects, we compare VMT to the 9-county Bay Area, just like the state recommended, and we rely on our congestion management agency regional tour-based model for these mappings. So this shows 2013 daily household VMT per capita ranges for San Francisco, and as we would suspect, San Francisco has the lowest VMT per capita in the region. So If a project were to somehow result in a VMT impact, we could use transportation demand management measures. But as shown in that prior map, that will be very rare, if ever happens. So we realized we need to do better than the status quo again. And so we didn't want to just rely on CEQA to get at better projects. So that is the focus of the SHIFT portion of our program. SHIFT applies uniformly to most new development, and it applies TDM measures to shift people out of cars and into sustainable modes. These measures are controlled by a developer and focus on the residents, workers, and visitors to a site. SHIFT is an ordinance that became effective March 2017, and it has three main features. The first is all projects subject to it are required to meet a points target based on the amount of parking provided. More parking, more points, more TDM that you have to do. How they reach that is through a menu of options. And then the last component is an implementation strategy. And this was really key for us. We require developers to document compliance of their measures and also fund staff through an administrative fee to review that compliance and conduct site visits. The other part of it is if the administrative fee covers staff to conduct research on the effectiveness of the measures over time, so we can try to be nimble, responsive, and up to date in this dynamic field. So that brings me then to applicability and sort of lessons learned. I think this program can have applicability elsewhere. The first is it has furthered my belief in the fundamental importance of what you measure in and outside of CEQA. My favorite author, Jane Jacobs, wrote, "Systems of thought, no matter how objective they may purport to be, have underlying emotional bases and values." So it's important to think about what systems and thought and underlying emotional bases and values are the criteria that your community is using. Here in San Francisco, we believed VMT aligned with our values and also met the requirements of CEQA. Second, CEQA should not substitute for other planning, as just heard from the last panelists. Other tools exist to get at challenges other than environmental impacts or even those impacts. This includes police powers like TDM measures through zoning and area planning. And speaking of that, area planning is where we expect the vast majority of our growth to occur. In these area plans, we actually have additional impact fees besides the one I talked about earlier, and we've identified the transportation investments that we want to focus on in those areas. So through this planning, we can use impact fees for a variety of transportation investments, such as transit, complete streets, as opposed to just relying on CEQA to fund auto delay mitigation. This program also provides more certainty to developers in understanding what their funding and mitigation requirements may be. So on some of those past points that I talk about, here's just an example that one of the next panelists will know really well. This project's in a low vehicle miles traveled area. It's adjacent to an under construction bus rapid transit line, and it's consistent with our area plan zoning. So we did CEQA analysis before we adopted VMT, and for our analysis, a year into it, we then discovered, okay, there's going to be 4 level of service impacts. Of those 4, we only had feasible mitigation for 2 of the intersections, and that feasible mitigation was traffic signals. We calculated the fair share cost of this development's impact on those intersections to be around $200,000. If this project would have came in post implementation of our invest fee, post implementation of our align, they wouldn't have had to do all this level of service analysis, but they would have had to pay an impact fee of over $5 million. So there are trade-offs, and in that example, it gets, the city's getting more from a developer, in my opinion, than doing years of a level of service analysis. And it also gets that people are inherently loss adverse. So give something greater back to them. Provide commitments to policies that not just remove automobile delay from CEQA, but actually provide something for numerous stakeholders. Depending on the component for our program, we had advocacy groups from neighborhood groups, transportation advocacy groups, transportation agencies, and actually developers for some pieces of this. And then lastly, move forward. This was really critical for us. As I said, we talked about this for over a decade. And I just suggest don't get stuck in paralysis by analysis mode. All criteria are subjective. We're going to get sued. If you're going to get sued, just have substantial evidence. If you're going to get sued, you're going to get sued. It doesn't matter if you're using LOS or VMT or whatever, you're going to get sued. So it's okay not to have all the answers. We certainly didn't. We don't yet. We'll continue to evolve, and so move forward. As my prior supervisor used to state, we're going from counting cars to actually doing something about them. And so I encourage you to do the same. Thank you.
All right, thank you, panel one, the big three. We're going to take a few questions in the transition between panel one and panel two. You'll see in your agenda, it does say a facilitated discussion after panel one. I forgot to mention, we're going to try and have that broader discussion at the end of panel two, so we can get most of the content out. We have Mark in the audience, and he can take a couple questions for panel one, if anyone has questions. If not, we can just, oh yeah, go ahead, Kamala.
So you talk about the context of developers in terms of the VMT analysis. How does that relate to public projects that don't actually have a developer? It's not doing the traditional things that we do CEQA under, but we still have to do that analysis or whatnot.
So we did one special thing that wasn't an OPR recommendation in terms of this for at least the CEQA portion. We exempted them. In effect, other than schools, almost all public facilities in San Jose are exempt, whether they be fire stations or pumping stations or libraries. We said these, in effect, either have very low trips or operate somewhat like retail. And if you know the OPR guidelines, there's a pretty good argument in there for why smaller retail sites really shouldn't be seen as major generators. And then on transportation projects, we of course exempted the VMT reducing projects right off the bat, and we really don't like what happened at the end with the guidelines and allowing transportation projects to potentially step out of the VMT realm. So we've made all VMT or transportation projects that we have oversight over actually have to do VMT analysis for it, and we wrote a strongly worded letter to the National Resources Agency rules process to make sure that doesn't go forward there.
Got about time for one more question. Anybody else? Otherwise, we will advance. Rob?
This is a question for Darren, just since you queued it up during your remarks. Could you talk a little bit about that idea of you have some projects that have LOS mitigations, kind of holdovers, and you said you developed kind of a framework for how to address those. Maybe you could just elaborate a little bit.
Thank you. Good question. We have a framework. It's a bit of an ad hoc process. So we look to see, when the project is coming in for permits, we look to see what kind of process would normally applied. in many cases, some of these real old projects are going through a revision process where they need to get re-entitled or modifications are approved. So in those cases, it's easier because as part of that re-review and re-approval process, we can do a new CEQA analysis. For those that don't need that and they're just going right to building permits, we look to see what kind of approval process it went through before and try to replicate that process with a CEQA determination. If a project, for example, was approved by the Planning Commission and there was public notice that was sent out, we'll send out public notice that there's a proposed CEQA determination that they're exempt. And the good news, most of Oakland is a less than significant impact under VMT, but in theory, there could be a project where you can't say we're going to eject the LOS mitigations and ignore VMT. So if they fail the VMT screening and it's a VMT impact, then they have other impacts that they need to worry about. So CEQA is about public disclosure, so we notify the public that there's this new CEQA determination, and then that's appealable. So if someone disagrees with that, that's appealable to the Planning Commission, and that's where you get your due process in public hearing.
Okay, thank you. Okay, time for panel 2. Get their slides queued up. Oh, you can clap. Not for me, but yeah, for panel 1. Thank you. All right, this looks like it. Okay. It's here, Andrea. All right. For panel 2, we have our esteemed experts who did work on some of the presentations you just heard, and he did some of the work for the analysis and feasibility and nexus studies. The panel features Andrea Ruiz Esquide, Bob Spencer, and Libby Seifel. Andrea will start. Andrea is an attorney working with the San Francisco City Attorney's Office in the Environment and Land Use team. She specializes in environmental laws and environmental review under both California and federal law, a specialty also in transportation and greenhouse gas reduction. She advises the Planning Department, the Historic Preservation Commission, and the Board of Supervisors on a multitude of projects and plans. Andrea received her Juris Doctorate from Berkeley School of Law, or Bolt School of Law, Berkeley, and also holds a PhD in history from Columbia University. Let me get through a couple more, and then you can start. Next, we have Bob Spencer. He'll speak after Andrea. Bob Spencer has 30 years of experience providing land use, economic, and financial consulting services to public agencies. His core of expertise is in public services and infrastructure and fiscal impact analysis. He is a nationally recognized expert in the area of development impact fees. Mr. Spencer has also taught at the University of California, Davis Extension, and has hosted and spoken at ULI conferences as well as ABAG. Bob has a Master of Public Policy degree from the Kennedy School at Harvard. And Libby Seifel is an urban economist and a certified planner. She's advised public and private clients on how to plan and accomplish successful infill developments. As president of Seifel Consulting, Libby has consulted on hundreds of clients and projects regarding triple bottom line, so looking at social equity, sustainability, and strong financial returns as objectives. She has a technical foundation in financial modeling and development feasibility testing. Libby has advised on plans in public and private partnerships throughout the state and financing programs that have catalyzed new development, mixed use throughout the state. Thank you. So Andrea, you're up.
Thank you. Thank you, Christy. Thank you, Kruti, for inviting me. My name is Andrea Ruiz Esquide, and I'm a deputy city attorney in the city of San Francisco. I've been there for about 11 years, and as Christy explained, most of my work, or a big chunk of my work, has to do with CEQA and transportation analysis and transportation policies more broadly. So I work with Wade closely and with Bob and Libby in the TSF that I'm going to be talking about a little bit today. So a lot of the presentation is going to be a little bit repetitive. I'm going to go through fast the slides that are most repetitive because this is there's a lot of convergence between the three big cities, and a lot of the issues that we faced and the approaches we've taken are similar. So first, these slides show that San Francisco, as you know, is growing really rapidly, and we don't have space, and we also don't want to create more roadway space for more vehicular travel. So we want to, for years now, Wade explained for more than 10 years, we've been trying to get rid of LOS, and we also have been trying to implement the transit first policy that's enshrined in our charter and in our codes. Oops, no. Well, it's going to be a little bit, the slide is a little bit down, but doesn't matter, same thing. So basically, our approach there's many policies that we've been implementing through many years to address the existing problems of the transportation network, but we also thought that we had to ask new development because the city is growing so much. So we had to ask new development to do their part to help solve the problem. And that's where the Transportation Sustainability Plan, or TSP, comes in. Transportation Sustainability Program, which has these three components that Wade already talked about. One is to align the environmental review under CEQA with our transportation policies and goals under the Transit First policy and others, so to move away from LOS towards VMT. The second one is a Tdm ordinance, which we call SHIFT, because it shifts travel away from cars to other more sustainable modes of transportation. And the third one is INVEST, or the fee, Transportation Sustainability Fee, or TSF. It's getting worse.
Getting worse. I'm so sorry. I'm not sure how to expand it, but
That's
the
best.
biggest it
That's word,
gets?
yeah.
Yeah. Otherwise, you just kind of just decide.
To the, like this?
Yeah. This is the little first one.
Okay, all right. So, and this is the same slide that Wade showed, and it basically shows how these three independent policy components, where each of them has value on its own, and each of them could have existed without the others. But the three of them really kind of converge and help create this more holistic program, which is the TSP. But I really like better this other slide, which is one of the older slides that we used internally in our city, our briefing internally with the different city departments or policymakers, because it really shows what I think Oakland or San Jose, one of the other two cities, showed, which is that there's a lot of virtuous kind of cycle going on here. The more you invest in multiple transportation improvements, then you're measuring what really matters in terms of the environmental impact. And then you are, and if you create TDM, you lead to better results as well. So the three are really, even though they're not necessarily connected, as a policy matter, they make a lot of sense to be together. Oops, ow. Now page up, hold on. Sorry about this. Well, then I'm going to go fast to the next couple slides. We had the Trust Task Force, which identified this huge need, and we created the fee in order to, we identified the need for the fee in order to fund the new infrastructure that was going to be needed to serve new development. And then, how do I move it a little bit? Let's see. There, better. There. So then we had the crucial question, which in this process of like 10 years that we shared together with weekly meetings of 2 hours, like same thing that we were discussing in some of the other city efforts. We had to decide what kind of fee would this be. We knew we needed the money, and we knew new development had to shoulder their responsibility, but our immediate kind of knee-jerk reaction was to go to CEQA and try to do a mitigation fee under CEQA. And that's explicitly authorized by the guidelines under that section 15130. And so we thought we were going to be able to do that, and we started thinking about the fee in those terms, but then we ran into some problems. And the problem, first of all, Of course, under CEQA, any fee that you charge, any mitigation that you impose has to address a particular impact on the environment. But here, because a lot of the impacts are impacts to intersections in which there are multiple projects that may be having a part, we would have to create fair share mechanisms and an actual CEQA mitigation plan. And those are really hard to implement. For example, in the example that Wade gave about the project on Potrero Hill, there was only a piece that we could have charged that developer. But most of the existing development there, we could not have retroactively charged a CEQA fee. So basically, we would have ended up with a little bit of funding for part of an intersection that we couldn't really spend elsewhere, because under CEQA, you have to mitigate the actual impact. You can't mitigate holistically somewhere else. So the CEQA straitjacket was kind of getting tight, and we started exploring the more broad development fee under just general development fee law. And likewise, it needs to mitigate the impact, but it's not just the impact to a particular environmental impact as defined under CEQA. It's more the impact to the demand that the new growth creates on public services or facilities. So it's broader. In the city thought that we had more discretion to do that. Likewise, same here in this world, same as in CEQA, we could not mitigate for existing conditions. We could only mitigate for the problem caused by new development. But because we could define our capital improvement plan more broadly, we could create a bigger pot of money to more effectively address the needs that we had. So in this sense, the development fee is more eminently fair share. You don't have to create a fair share mechanism and wait for someone else to come along in the same particular intersection. It's more flexible. Okay, let me see if I do this. All right, so now I'm going to give you a little bit of background on the legal background for the fees. Development fees are based on the police power, which is enshrined in Article 9 of the California Constitution, and allows very broadly cities and counties to enact any rules or regulations, any laws to fulfill the health and safety of the locality. There's only very few limitations. Basically, number one, it needs to be reasonably related to the public good, whatever law the locality does. So there's a reasonable relation requirement. Number two, it cannot be extraterritorial. You can address your jurisdiction, but not beyond. And number three, it cannot be against or contradict the general laws. So there could be a preemption problem, which is not the case here. So that's the constitutional authority where all the cities and counties' power to do this comes from. And then there's lots of minefields in the Constitution as well, as I'm sure you're aware, because of the whole taxpayer revolt beginning in the 70s with Prop 13, and a bunch of other propositions that I'm not going to go into detail, but basically the power of cities and counties to get money through taxation has been severely limited. And so as that has happened, jurisdictions have shifted more and more towards fees as opposed to taxes. And fees were explicitly exempted from Prop 26, which was the latest of these propositions that passed, as being allowed and valid. So the only other general restriction that we have to be aware of is under the US Constitution and basic takings law. The fee charged has to have a logical nexus and a rough proportionality to whatever the impact is. So you cannot ask a development to solve the whole puzzle. You cannot ask to solve more than its fair share of the eminent problem that the development is causing. And there's a lot of statutory requirements codified in the Mitigation Fee Act, which is in the government code, and which establishes mostly procedures. It's mostly a procedural act. It doesn't really give new rights or authority to do this, but it basically establishes the ground rules of how to do this. And it requires the reasonable relationship requirement that I was talking to you about. Basically, with those are the findings that the jurisdiction has to make. That the fee's use and type is related to the fee, to the development on which the fee is imposed. That the need for the public facility and the development, that there's a relationship, and that the amount of the fee and the cost is attributable to the development. And then the Mitigation Fee Act also has requirements on how to pass the fee. Basically, there has to be a public hearing, there has to be clear public notice with some time requirements, but it's really not that onerous. So what we did is that we used to have a transportation impact fee called the TIDF that dated from the 80s and was originally applicable only downtown and only to office projects. But we made it extensive through the TSF to residential development also and citywide. And we passed a new TSF ordinance that went into the planning code. And just a little bit, I'm going to talk for a second about the case law provides some insight into what is required and what is allowed or not allowed. Overall, the courts are very quite differential. As long as you have substantial evidence on in the record to show that there is a reasonable relationship and that you have met the mandated findings from the Mitigation Fee Act and from the Nolan-Dolan test, you should be fine. And also, agencies are entitled to some flexibility on how to spend the money. In the example that I was giving before, like if you can get impact those $5 million from that project, for example, and you could put them in a pot and you can have a capital improvement plan, you can spend them later in a facility further away, not necessarily next door to that project. So it's much more flexible. And there's been challenges in which developers have said, but my project is not seeing any of this, improvements. And courts have said, well, these are improvements that go through a long-term planning effort. You can't really ask the agency to identify right now all the improvements. It can be pretty broad, it can be pretty flexible, and it can be long-term. So as long as it's a reasonable relationship, I think you should be fine. And then as we went about this effort, in order to show that reasonable relationship and rough proportionality, we prepared a nexus study. Even though it's not really required by the law that you have to do a nexus study, it's good practice to do it, and most jurisdictions do it. But you don't need to call it a nexus study, or you don't need to do it separately, even as long as there's evidence in your record that you have done this careful thinking. And the nexus just look at the relationship between the burden that the new development created for the city's transportation system and how much could we charge. So Bob is going to talk about that more at length in a minute, so I'm not going to go into that discussion, but just to tell you that we did go ahead and prepare that. And then once we had the number of how much, what was it going to cost, it was a huge number per square footage, we said if we charge that, it's not going to be, most developers are going to not be able to proceed, or they may not. So we went ahead and we hired Libby to do a feasibility study and think about, in practice, how much of that money does it really make sense as a policy matter to try to recover. And then again, this is not a legally required item, but it's good practice and highly advisable. And then we ended up, after all that effort, adopting the fee, which was basically non-residential development went up considerably, and it was tailored, bigger projects paid more, and residential development that used to pay nothing paid a fee. PDR, which are like industrial uses, remained the same. And this is similar to the slide that Wade had, I think. Basically shows how we had big buckets of expenditure on how we're going to spend this fee, and that was supported by the Nexus. We didn't say we're going to build exactly this, but we said we're going to build projects like this. And we justified that in how much we could charge. And that's it. Thank you.
All right, we're going to plug and play here with my presentation. Bob Spencer with Urban Economics. Good to see you all today. Can you put it in the presenter view?
Yes. Is it PowerPoint?
Yeah, PowerPoint. All right, so I'm going to ask folks to put on their thinking caps. We're going to dive a little deeper into this esoteric topic called nexus analysis and mitigation fees. That's fine if you want to do this. Okay. Oh, perfect. Yeah. Building off everybody that came before me, and thank you so much for the other panelists for your work. Thank you to ABAG for inviting us all here today. Thank you all for devoting your afternoon to this fascinating topic. And as conservative as I may be in my dress, I think I'm the only one, maybe one of two, wearing a tie in the room. We're going to talk about some very innovative stuff here. So fasten your seatbelts. We're talking about local funding for transportation improvements. There's lots of other funding out there that you all put together, state, federal, through MTC, et cetera. This is about how to make up that local piece of the pie. And we're talking about public capital improvements. There's lots of other things you can do in transportation. I'll reference those. You know, there's TDM, there's a lot of project design stuff. We're going to focus on the use of mitigation fees to accommodate the impacts of growth by funding capital improvements. But we're going to keep in mind these other buckets that have been referenced by the other speakers. These other, they're exactions. They're all exactions. If you want to use the legal term, they're all requirements imposed on new development. Fees fund the capital. Then you do a mitigation analysis under CEQA, and you can come up with CEQA mitigations. But as you're learning today, it's a very different process. And the big theme, if there's a big theme take out today, it's that to look at these as very different and to really disconnect them. And then finally, there's this bucket of project design requirements. Darren talked about parking requirements. San Jose, Oakland, and San Francisco all talked about TDM requirements. Those all show up in these design guidelines that you have. So you've got these three, if you will, tools to mitigate, if you want to use that term, or accommodate, as we do in the impact fee world, the impacts of growth on the transportation system. So these all overlap. You've heard lots of stories today about how they overlap. We're going to talk about how they overlap different under a VMT CEQA threshold. And another theme today, you've heard about how planners have been relying on CEQA and the LOS requirement to simply fund their transportation capital improvement plans. Throw that out the window. It's a new world. They're separate. You got VMT and you have impact fees. No longer think of them together. So keep those three in mind as we go through this. So, you know, traditionally, the two would be, in many ways, as we've heard today, linked at the hip, the impact fee, the CEQA analysis. You do a growth forecast for an impact fee. You do, you know, come up with your project description, of course, for a CEQA analysis, and a cumulative growth forecast, often the same thing. You use LOS policies in both cases to come up with either projects to be funded under a fee program or mitigations under CEQA. You apply those policies to travel demand modeling or a CEQA impact, the TIA, Transportation Impact Analysis approach. You come up with a list of CIP projects for your fee program or a list of EIR mitigation measures for your CEQA program. You get the sense these have all been rather linked at the hip. Come up with maybe a finance plan in between, and finally you end up with a fee and a set of mitigation measures. A fee that's, you know, cumulative, applied citywide, and these mitigation measures that come along project by project, but again linked. Throw that out the window. So the themes that I've seen as a practitioner in this field for now about over 20 years, impact fee programs are becoming more ubiquitous, and the key thing is that in these urban areas where there is traditionally no room to expand roadways, urban areas, dense urban areas, the San Franciscos, the San Jose's, the Oaklands, are now picking up on the impact fee, the Mitigation Fee Act, as a tool that they need to access for funding. Impact fees have been really designed and predominantly used in greenfield areas, of which San Jose also has a large amount, but suburban development to fund new streets and expanded boulevards as greenfield development occurs. But urban areas are now picking up on this tool. At the same time, we're shifting to complete streets. It's not about adding lanes. There's no room to add lanes in San Francisco, Oakland, in many cases San Jose. It's all about complete streets, multimodal improvements. And finally, we have this VMT shift under CEQA. So what happens in the impact fee world as CEQA is now moving to the VMT world? Well, sorry, I jumped ahead. On the left side of this slide, that's the old way of looking at stuff. We get more vehicles, we apply LOS policies, we figure out how to mitigate them. But what about, now we've got these complete street improvements. Well, unfortunately, and if there's one thing you remember about my presentation today, VMT does not work for an impact fee. There's no such, we may get there. And I appreciate the comments from San Jose about the science and the R&D needed. And we may get to a point where we may have a VMT-based fee, but we're not there yet. And here's, one of the main reasons. You go with a VMT threshold. In San Francisco, no one would pay it because everybody's underneath the, underneath the threshold. So you're losing all that potential revenue. So we need to separate the two in your mind. VMT doesn't work. For the real transportation planning nerds in the room, you probably have heard of multimodal LOS, trying to look at bike and ped and transit. That doesn't work either. So suffice it to say, we got to come up with something else. All right. So what's a transportation planner to do? CEQA, we've heard about this, streamline approval through using a VMT threshold, focus your mitigation on reducing vehicle trips, all those TDM measures, and, you can still you're going to include some capital projects. There could be some bike-related projects, et cetera, but keep in mind, if you go to the technical analysis guidelines from OPR for VMT, I think there's about 20 examples of mitigation measures they list in towards the end of those guidelines. 2 of them are public capital improvements. 18 of them are project design, or TDM measures. So again, the world of CEQA is not a place to get your capital dollars. But there may be some, and that's that overlap in the circles earlier. The overlap's not necessarily going to go away, but it's going to be reduced. For impact fees, we need a nexus that supports multimodal improvements, and that's going to be the guts of what I'm going to get to in the next couple of slides. That can fund complete streets citywide. You want to make these improvements everywhere, not necessarily right next to the project. And that's one of the great values of fee programs is not only does everybody pay them, so it's not just getting mitigations out of the big projects and the ministerial permits, just skate by underneath the CEQA radar. Everybody pays at the building permit stage, and everybody can therefore participate in a citywide funding program. And again, you could be funding some CEQA mitigations, those related to capital improvements. So here's the approach that we've been developing. Actually, this started in the city of Pleasanton. Anyone here from Pleasanton? About 15 years ago. It's the first time that I used this asset-based facility standard. But now we're using it Oakland, San Francisco, et cetera, Santa Rosa, El Cerrito. And what it is, think about a park impact fee. You take all your park acres, you add them up, you come up with an amount of existing developed acres, you divide by your existing population, and you get acres per capita. Very simple nexus. I have this many parks, I have this many people today. All I'm doing is asking new development to maintain that facility standard by paying a fee that allows me to buy an additional park and develop it, buy the land and develop it to maintain whatever that existing standard is. It's actually been litigated, this approach. A little city called Lemoore down in the Central Valley went up through appellate level, was held. This approach was held up as appropriate and reasonable. It met the reasonable relationship requirements that Andrea mentioned under the Mitigation Fee Act and the U.S. constitutional case law we're under. So let's apply that now to transportation. Hey, you know, in fact, this is the approach used in most impact fees outside of transportation. Libraries, criminal justice, you know, you name it. So let's do it with transportation. Let's use for demand average daily person trips. Now, San Francisco, they used motorized, so they had autos plus transit vehicles, and that's a nuance we can get into in the Q&A. But I think the easiest way to do this multimodally across bike, ped, transit cars is daily person trips. So it's a person, we don't care what mode they take, and this is key because now the impact is mode agnostic. And we look at how many square feet of roadway you have per average daily person trip, say signalized intersections. You basically quantify your transportation infrastructure, existing transportation infrastructure, and develop these standards per average daily person trip. By the way, if anybody would like a copy of this presentation, give me your business card at the end. Happy to send it to you. So what does that look like? Well, no big surprise. When we put dollars, because we've got to get it into a fee, you know, an amount to pay, when we put replacement costs onto these quantities, you know, guess what? Roadways are 3/4 of your transportation, existing transportation investment. Well, that's because cars have been the dominant way of getting around. And then you've got sidewalks and, you know, medians and off-street paths, which often are for bike and pedestrian. And what we're doing with this fee is we're allowing cities to shift what has been an investment in roadways to now invest in other modes without getting caught up in the details of proportions and how much have you invested in one and how much do you want to invest in another. This, again, is a mode agnostic fee. There's a couple other ways of doing the nexus, which actually we used in San Francisco, and I won't belabor here in the interest of time, because I really like to get in the Q&A and get in some interchange with folks. You can look at transit separately. In San Francisco, we actually, because San Francisco is so transit dependent, we did some separate transportation modeling with a transportation consultant, and we looked at congestion based on ridership. We looked at a facility standard based on vehicle capacity. I mean, really, this is very much like roadway LOS, but just turning it into putting it in the transit world. And we came up a list of projects, specific projects that we need to address the additional congestion caused by additional transit riders. So we have the fee going to vehicle maintenance, improved maintenance, which improves the number of seats on the roadway by improving the maintenance of vehicles. We have expanded vehicle fleets. We have upgraded control systems. BART is a piece of this. So that's another, you know, in addition to the asset-based approach I just went over, that's another approach. The downside, I should say, of this approach is that you're tied to that list of capital projects. And that was always the problem with the old LOS roadway impact fee. Came up with a list of capital projects to mitigate cumulative growth. Technically, though a lot of my clients seem to find took some flexibility with the use of revenues, but technically all those fees you collect are only supposed to go to that list of capital projects. So you are constrained in the same way with this approach. The final approach, just quick, you can just take the old fair share approach. If we have $1 million improvement we need, and hey, it's going to benefit everybody. It's going to correct an existing deficiency over here in part of town. It's going to add some expanded capacity over there in part of town. It could be pedestrian, it could be bike, it could be transit, it could be roadways. Teasing out, you know, what's growth share and, you know, technically what is the growth piece, what is the existing piece. Forget it, it's too complicated, science isn't there. So we're just gonna take the $1 million, we're gonna look at the planning horizon. At the planning horizon, 24% of the trips at the planning horizon are from growth. So guess what? Growth is gonna pay for 24% of that $1 million, 240,000, or, you know, 2.4 million if it's a $10 million improvement. Very simple, very easy to do. You can do this on the back of a napkin. The challenge is you better have 74% of your CIP funded with other revenues. So you can't make that fee any greater than this share of the cumulative growth of trips in your jurisdiction. So that's a constraint. But it's another approach, and it can work with certain buckets of capital improvements. This is just repeating what I just told you. So let's go to the final, wrap it up here. So now that earlier slide about the old approach, let's revise that a bit. Okay. You still have a growth forecast and project descriptions under CEQA and cumulative growth forecasts. Now you've got complete streets policies for your impact fee, developing your impact fee program, and VMT thresholds for your CEQA program. For the impact fee, you're going to do all this master planning. You're going to do active transportation plans. You're going to, you know, you probably do some traditional travel demand modeling because you still have some roadway and intersection issues. On the CEQA side, you're going to do this VMT analysis. Very different. On the fee side, you're going to come up with a project list based on all these plans and all this analysis. So all that good planning still happens. On the CEQA side, there may be some capital improvements associated with it, but like you've heard today, a lot of it is project design related and TDM related, and not necessarily capital related. And either way, you got to come up with a finance plan. So what's different? We take the impact fee analysis out of this now. We don't wed ourselves to this, and we simply use, say, an asset-based approach to come up with a maximum justified fee. You bring someone on board like Libby Seifel or another urban economist who can do this feasibility analysis, because that fee based on the roadways and that cumulative asset inventory you've got, as you heard from San Francisco, far higher than you're going to be able to afford. So you need the feasibility analysis to tell you what fee to adopt, and the revenue from that goes into your funding plan. So finally, here's how it worked out in the other cities. We've done this now in 4 cities. I'm sorry I didn't get Pleasanton on here, but that was 15 years ago, so I forgot about it until actually today. Stood up in front of you guys. The asset-based approach was used in all jurisdictions. San Francisco had some nuances that you can see on the slide here. Oakland tailored their fee, as Darren mentioned, to fund those old LOS requirements, simply so that there was a mechanism for somebody to easily mitigate under the old requirements. El Cerrito, on the other hand, built their active transportation plan into the EIR for the San Pablo specific plan. And so the fee is funding basically the project that the EIR analyzed. So different ways to do it. We can get into the nuances in the Q&A. Thanks very much.
Hello. While Christy's getting the slides up, I have to ask you a few questions, maybe just to wake you up, and we'll see if you're honest or not. So how many of you basically drive a car to work? So about half of you. And how many of you would say you go more than 20 miles to work a day? Okay. And how many of you go more than 50 miles to work a day? Okay, it's nobody in the room. I figured most probably that was pretty safe that that would happen. So how many of you live in communities where if new development happens, the first concern that everybody has is what's the impact going to be on traffic in their neighborhood? Okay. And how many of you have progressive parking policies in your cities right now that provide for maximums or no parking allowed, developments with no parking, many of you have parking minimums still in your community? Sorry. Minimum, well, all right, so let me just say, how many of you require that there be a certain amount of parking, and you do it like it's car per bedroom? That's the way I usually think about it, right? Car per bedroom. Okay. I think of that as a minimum policy because you're basically saying, look, you got to provide 2 cars for every 2-bedroom unit, or sometimes they'll say 2.5 cars for a 3-bedroom unit, 1 car for 1-bedroom unit. Sometimes if you're really progressive, you have a half car. I joke right now that it used to be in real estate, everything was location, location, location. Now it's all parking, parking, parking. And VMT, as we've heard about today, is all about parking and shifting modes and doing things differently. And we're going to have the same problem with these slides. So I'm repeating the same slide as before, but the reason that I want to emphasize this is what we're trying to do, right, by these programs is we're trying to shift people away from driving, right, away from parking, and we're trying to shift them to other modes. But banks and local residents and a lot of people are very used to driving. They're very used to having parking, and they get very upset when we try to make these changes. And developers, who I'm going to channel today, I'm an urban planner, but I love to actually try to bridge the gap between developers and local residents and public officials and planners to try to explain how developers have to look at this. And so as developers are looking at this, they may be all in the groove about reducing parking, but they may have a lender or an underwriter or 20, 30, 100, 200 screaming residents in their neighborhood saying, we can't do this. So in the context of all of this, as I'm trying to go through this process, what we've been trying to do in San Francisco, which is one of the unique places where we can actually do this because of what we've shown. We have very low VMT. We have lots of people who take transit instead of drive cars. And where we have, how many people from San Francisco in this room, besides Wade? Okay, so I'm somewhat safe in saying that we have one of the worst processes in terms of getting entitlements in the entire Bay Area, though we have improved a lot. We have improved a lot, thanks to all the great staff. And when we started this out, Bob, I don't know how many years ago we started out, 8 years ago, we really focused on streamlining pre-development, as I'm going to show you in this process. We have made inroads to do that, but what we found was that the streamlining that we thought might be able to be accomplished wasn't quite as much as we thought, and it would affect projects differentially. As a result of that, our goal was to lower pre-development costs. So we want to make it easier, cheaper, and faster for developers to get entitlements by reducing their risk, by making it go faster. It could be cheaper. That could help them pay for more fees. And that would enable them to pay for these fees. And also, we didn't really talk about this today, but Wade knows we did a whole analysis with him on the impact, the economic impact of transportation demand management programs, because there's also an economic impact on that. And in the context of all of this is that infill development in the Bay Area is very complex. It takes a lot of time and risk to undertake. I like to joke and say to people, if you had $1 million, basically if you had your house, an average house in California, would you risk the value of your entire house in California on the fact that you would get an approval to build 3 houses where you live, right? Well, that's what developers do every day. Also, they have to deal with long-term property owners that often have to be persuaded with a lot of persuasion and a lot of money to sell their property. They have a lengthy land use approval process. And then they always have, we're in voting day, the public process and the risk of litigation, and my absolute least favorite type of planning, ballot box land use. And last but certainly not least, if there's one theme I leave you with today, is you have to look at these impact fees in the context of everything else you are requiring. And community benefits are the new strategy, and a very important strategy, because I'm a really big believer in affordable housing, and I'm a really big believer in delivering high-quality development that benefits the community. But if you add on community benefits of significant cost in addition to all the impact fees that you want to charge, and in addition to a very high inclusionary housing requirement, in order to provide affordable housing, you can't get your project to go forward. I want to all recommend that if you haven't seen this publication, Charlie Long, former city manager, turned developer, active in Oakland, some of you might know him, really great guy. He wrote this book, Finance for Real Estate Development. It's actually, I find it very accessible, and we, for ULI, we've done these trainings for public officials in San Francisco and in Oakland, and just recently did one in San Jose, and we reference this publication a lot. And one of the things that Charlie has really reinforced to me is that, you know, as pre-development is the most risky phase, as project risk goes up, right, project returns have to go up. Because again, think of it, if you have your $1 million, which is your house, and you're gonna put your entire house at risk to get through the end of the process, how much would you want to return on that? Or even more importantly, it's your brother-in-law's house, and your brother-in-law is going to lend you the $1 million, and he wants a return on that $1 million. How much you're going to have to pay him for this opportunity to potentially lose his house? So people get really focused on the fact that developers make gobs and gobs and gobs of money, and that they shouldn't be able to make gobs and gobs and gobs of money, which is an arguable point. However, the reality is that in order for you to proceed with development, you have to create enough value by the development that when you subtract all the development costs, and we have rapidly increasing construction costs right now, you have to be able to pay for your construction costs, your land costs, and you have to pay enough to be able to incentivize equity capital to come in with high risk and a return. Just think about that $1 million. How much would you require in a return on an annual basis to take this risk? You have to pay back that capital, and you have to pay back that capital first. You as a developer, you don't get any money until you pay that development capital first. So what I've started to do is use the term developer margin and return, not just developer profit, because in reality, that margin is what's going to pay back the investor capital, and it's what's going to pay back the developer, but it has to take into account the fact that, excuse me, shit happens. Like, you know, like things don't happen the way you think. It takes 10 years for us to do a TSF, TSP program. It similarly takes 10 years in many communities in California to get something to happen. So this is a very simple development feasibility framework that I just want to layer to you, and then I'm going to explain how this relates to the TSF. So this is the developer margin at the top. As I just said, your project value has to be sufficient to pick up all of your project costs and leave you enough for a margin or return. And those key development costs include land, and I'm going to talk about residual land value in a minute, but you have to be able to pay for the land. You don't have site control, you don't have a project. You have to pay for hard construction costs, which often represent 50, 60, 70% of the cost of a project. Parking is a major cost factor these days. Think of it, many parking spaces cost $50,000 to $100,000 a space if you're going very, very deeply, deeply down, and you have bad soils and you have water table issues and whatever. Like the further you go down, maybe it's averaging a higher number. And if you do it above grade, maybe it's ranging between $20,000 to $40,000 a space. That is usually what it costs per door, as developers like to say, to buy land in communities. So each parking space is kind of equivalent in some communities to land cost. And then you have to, you know, pick up all these soft costs, and included within those soft costs are public fees. So when a developer goes out to buy a piece of property, the property that they buy, it has to be valued based on what's the existing use. So if it's got a whole bunch of parking on it and it's generating parking revenues, or it's got a commercial development or an industrial development, and it's also what can it be potentially used for? Because a landowner is not going to just sell necessarily based on existing use, but you're most probably going to have to pay them a premium based on the future use. So what happens when a developer is looking at this is they look at what's the potential sales price, what else in the market's been selling for a certain amount, what can they negotiate, and then they do a residual land value analysis, which as how much can I afford to pay for land given the economics of my project. So pulling up this simple slide again, basically if I'm a developer and I say, okay, I think my project could be worth, in this case, $600,000 per unit, and I have to get a margin of return of about 20%, then that leaves me with like $500,000 to pay my soft costs, my construction financing, my hard construction, and my government fees, right? That yellow government fees, and then I have pre-development expenses. And then once I take that calculation, what I can afford to pay is that residual land value, which in this case is pretty far, is most probably about $50,000 a unit in this case, which might be true in a number of you if you're in East Bay communities or something. So we took a very similar approach to what a developer might do when they're looking at land to try to assess the feasibility of the Transportation Sustainability Fee, or the TSF. And what we did is we developed a set of prototypes. These are development projects, theoretical projects that might be built throughout the city of San Francisco. One thing we didn't talk about yet is that we have a series of area plans in San Francisco, and many of them have neighborhood-specific impact fees, okay? So we had to analyze those neighborhood-specific impact fees. We had to figure out, this was something Bob, Andrea spent a lot of time about, what credits were going to be against these neighborhood fees, because some of them included a transportation component. And some places, frankly, didn't have any fees. And since we were changing the TSF, or the TIDF, the former transportation fee, was a fee that was only on non-residential development, and we're expanding it to include residential development, we focused our prototypes on residential development. So you can see this is a comparison of what the existing TIDF was and what the base case was for the TSF. We haven't talked about the politics of this. If you want, when we get to that point, we can fill you in on the politics, but basically we went through a run at this, and we told the development community that at that time that the fee was going to be about $6. This was a compromise sort of thing. And that was where the sort of baseline fee was from that sort of recessionary compromise. So what we did is we analyzed for each of these 10 prototypes. We said, okay, how much would a developer pay if they were paying the TIDF, right? And then how much would they have to pay with the TSF, right? And then what would be their area plan credit? And in some cases, I want to just point out, see on Geary Avenue, there was a retail component. So the retail component would have paid a small amount of the TIDF before, but the residential would have been exempt. Oh, and what I just want to point out here is you can see that in some cases we're talking about an increase of $0, right, to $2 million in these prototypes. So it did make a big difference. And then what we did, with a lot of great help from the planning department, is we analyzed what we thought were the pre-development time savings, potentially, from a streamlined transportation review process that would come about because of these modifications in the transportation review that were going to be done, and then also the environmental review savings. And when we started out, we thought we were going to have most of the prototypes experience these savings, but the more we studied and evaluated this and talked to CEQA consultants and planners in the planning department, we learned that it wasn't really going to make that big of a difference, unfortunately. Only where we had an environmental report where it was really required, and maybe we wouldn't have to do that again, maybe we would be able to have a big savings there. And it turned out of all these prototypes, only one had a real major cost savings. Many had some time savings, but cost savings. So then Bob ran all his numbers. He figured out the maximum justified fee of $31 a square foot for residential. The developers were really, really happy with that number. And $88 for non-residential and $26 for PDR, which would totally freak out our PDR advocates. So then we ran residual land value analyses sort of before and after, right, with TIDF and TSF. And we looked at, okay, if you do this TSF, how much do you have left in residual land value? And we compared these two numbers to see how much this was going to affect development, assuming that we kept the same margin, developer margin, holistically across the product type. And then we used a metric of not varying the residual land value, or trying to achieve no more than a 10% decrease in residual land value. And the summary of our findings were, as surprise, surprise, the results varied a lot by location, by building scale, and proposed use. The environmental time and cost savings may or may not occur. In fact, in 6 out of 10 cases, it didn't. In neighborhoods where we had some neighborhoods here, we didn't really emphasize this as much in the analysis that I just showed you. We had neighborhoods, our outer neighborhoods, particularly because we were doing this analysis kind of as we were coming out of the recession, where market rent and prices aren't high enough to warrant investment, say out in the Excelsior and the Bayview, and that the TSF will further inhibit development feasibility, meaning projects likely won't pencil. However, those projects wouldn't pencil anyway. And the financial analysis indicates that the TSF, this was our analysis, should not be set at higher than 125% of the base value. We had a lot of internal debates with city staff about what was the right thing. Should we really conclude at the base case, because that's what had been originally discussed with the development community? How far could we push it? But the conclusion was not to go above 125%. I do want to say, as I am concluding this, that our Board of Supervisors loves to make changes. I'm sure that you have city councils that do the same thing. So what we proposed and what they adopted was slightly different. And there's been a recent proposal to increase the fee $5 a square foot, which was staved off to $2 a square foot. And on top of that, we put in a 25% inclusionary housing requirement. So now we have really made it difficult in San Francisco. So we can get into all this. I had to be controversial in my statements, and I'm happy to be even more controversial in answering questions. But as was said earlier, to quote Albert Einstein, life is like riding a bicycle. To keep your balance, you must keep moving, even though there's all these difficulties that you're going to experience. Got to keep moving. And then I have to do my plug for my outfit, which is my bike-friendly outfit. And I want to say that another key to the accomplishment of VMT and these kinds of programs is buy local. And my commitment is, since I'm a fashionista, is that I buy clothes only from women or as much of my clothes as I can that are made in San Francisco from local women. So if anyone wants recommendations of local women, clothiers or jewelers or whatever, I'm the person to see.
Thank you so much. So much great information. Well, we are close to 4. I do want to leave some room for question and answer. We had so many questions at the last forum. So we have a couple mics we can circulate in the audience, and we'll have panel 1 folks come back to the table if they would, and get some questions answered. So if panelists can stick around for another 10, 15 minutes, is that okay? Great.
Any takers?
Thanks. Joe LeClaire with San Mateo County. I just wondered, scale economies of doing this kind of work for smaller jurisdictions. I can understand why it works well for larger cities, but when you're looking at lots of little cities ranging in size from 25,000 to 70,000 population, there's a lot of work to take on to come up with such a fee. So I just wonder if it's something that is cost effective for smaller local governments to take on, or is it something that's going to have to be developed at the broader scale, and then we'll learn as you go.
That the asset-based approach to a nexus analysis is a lot less costly than your typical transportation impact fee that requires a traffic planning consultant to run a travel demand model and develop a CIP. The nexus analysis can be done almost on the back of an envelope. So that's very inexpensive. But that ends up with this maximum justified fee, right? Which is far in excess of what you can afford. So then it's a judgment call. Then do we need to bring in the outside economic analysis like Libby demonstrated? Can we, well, I'll stop there and let Libby answer for herself, but the nexus analysis can be very simple. Now, aside from all that, you still have the ongoing transportation planning. I mean, whether you're a small or big community, you still have to come up with a CIP, right? So that cost is there regardless. And I'll see if Libby has anything else to add.
I would add two things. One, I think it's better to do it part of another planning process or something else that you want to do. And as I pointed out earlier, I think it's really important to do this holistically. So you've got to look at what other policies you're undertaking, particularly affordable housing. We've been doing a lot of studies lately on that for communities. And I think that's really important. And then also in San Mateo County, you actually did a county-wide nexus study for housing, for affordable housing. So I do think that that kind of regional or sub-regional approach is something to actually really think about and build upon.
Yeah, and one last thing. On the economic feasibility, I've been a part of a lot of impact fee studies over the years that basically the judgment on feasibility went to the public hearing in the city council. I mean, so you, as helpful, if you want to push the envelope, you want to, somebody like Libby on your team, but it's not to say you need that for any legal defensibility. I mean, it just becomes a political question. How much can the community afford?
Well, and the only thing that I wanted to just add to this, because I didn't say it in my remarks, is, and I'm working with MTC on the CASA process on this about housing production, is we are seeing more and more communities adopting more and more exactions or higher and higher requirements to prevent development from happening, or certain politicians from doing that. And so I feel that having somebody, it doesn't have to be a consultant, it can be developers from your community, it can be, other folks. I think it's so important to have that voice to actually push back on doing what I think sometimes happens, which is negotiation at the dais without facts, without understanding. And then you have a program where basically we're just not getting housing built in the Bay Area.
I'll add a quick thought to that. I think coming from the VMT world into this exact problem that we're seeing here, so many of the mitigations for VMT really are going to be regional in scope. And so kind of marrying those two processes together may, and we keep thinking in San Jose, like this is really begging us to do this at a regional level.
Okay.
There we go. Libby, I had a question for you because your last point you had in bold about the base cost and 125. I can't say that I fully understood what, I thought it was maybe an important point that I wasn't understanding. And so I was wondering if you'd be able to clarify with an example what you were talking about there.
Yeah, so basically the TIDF fee amount, and we were doing this in 2015, so it was like $6, and so we were doing 125% of $6.19, which worked out to be close to like $8 or something. Sorry, I'm not looking at it, and then I think ultimately what got adopted was closer to $9. So it was basically just a multiplication. It was 125% of that, but we tested base case 125%, 150%. And 250%, and then we didn't even try to do the maximum justified fee because it was like so high.
Anybody else? Go down there. Dear.
This question I think came out a little bit. We were talking about nexus studies with Bob over there, The Economist, and I do want to say it was a wonderful presentation, wonderful hearing from everybody, but I think we're kind of glossing over the fact that there's two pieces to the VMT. There's the trip reduction and trip generation piece, and then the trip length. And to date, I've yet to see any legally defensible documents discussing the trip length portion of the work. So I was hopeful we might be able to discuss a little bit about how cities who have adopted this are dealing with the trip length situation. If you're all under the regional threshold, it's less of a concern, but once you are in a jurisdiction that's higher, reducing to the regional level and then reducing 15% below that, if your trip lengths are off by 40% or 50% in the modeling, which is the case for a lot of those jurisdictions, there's not a lot of faith that the modeling or that the information going into the analysis is going to be legally defensible.
This is Wade from San Francisco. Crap in, crap out, right? So I think for San Francisco, we are going to be screened out most of the time, but we still need substantial evidence to support our mapping. And we have a tour-based model that we've tried to document everything by, and including the trip length. But I'm sort of going to pivot from that question a little bit, in that there's going to be lots of situations where you're just going to have to adopt significant unavoidable impacts too. I think that this is what it fundamentally gets at. In San Francisco, for decades, we were adopting significant unavoidable impacts on LOS because we couldn't fit any more cars in already LOS EF intersections. It's going to be the opposite now. Suburban jurisdictions are going to have to decide, do we put housing in greenfield sites, or do we try to locate it in our 15% below the city average site? So I know that doesn't directly answer your trip length question, but I think it really gets at where should housing and development occur. I don't know.
Could I add?
Sure.
Yeah. I think in this new world, if your project is over the average, we just don't have and the comment was made about TDM. You know, we just don't have the tools at a project level to really mitigate a VMT impact. We just don't. And the tools are regional in nature if we're going to use them. They're regional transportation infrastructure that has a regional impact on these vehicle trips. I just don't see the ability to mitigate VMT very easily if you're above average.
Other question? Oh, go ahead.
I'll add a little bit to that because I think there's actually quite a lot in your question that is going to lead to where we're going, right? One, the land use issue is actually primary. We've constantly said in our process, half of what we're trying to get out of this is better land use according to our transportation system. And that is directly addressing the trip length thing, right? It's access instead of mobility as the frame. Secondly, yes, regionalism, right? It's coming down to, look, we need Transbay there, we need Diridon, or Transbay here, we need Diridon in San Jose, and then we need services that, I don't know, I had to take a circuitous route to here from San Jose all the way through the East Bay and around because Caltrain runs a very slow train every hour during the day. We can't survive as a region under this framework unless we start addressing those things.
Other questions? Rob.
This question, excuse me, is for Libby, but perhaps Oakland or San Francisco or San Jose representatives on this side of the table could answer too. You had, towards the end of your slides, you talked about estimating the cost and time savings associated with kind of the environmental streamlining. And you quickly noted that in maybe 6 of 10 cases you looked at, there really wasn't a cost savings. Maybe you could elaborate on that a little bit, and maybe particularly Oakland also, if you have any thoughts on what you've seen so far with your policy. Are you actually seeing cost and time savings with streamlining?
So I should have pointed out that because we were studying area plans, and because the point of the area plans in part was to provide planning guidelines and environmental review for certain size projects, that if you fit within that envelope, you had a theoretical environmental clearance. So I should have made that more clear. The second thing is that we were specifically studying some prototypes that were quite small. So when you actually looked at the impact or what they would be required to do, you know, and in San Francisco, you could most probably get an exemption from I always forget what these are called, the transportation impact study, whatever that thing is that you have to do. Transportation impact study, the one you're redoing? Okay, the transportation impact study that the city's in the process of redoing. So they had certain standards. So if you didn't generate enough trips or vehicle miles traveled, you were below that standard. It didn't trigger environmental review. So that was part of the situation. And then the other situation was that it would be actually the same level of environmental review no matter what. So that was, oh yeah, and you, Andrea, you should address it.
Just a very small thought on that. I think part of the problem too is that at the beginning of the process, because remember how I had described it, we conceived of the fee at the very beginning as a potential fee under CEQA. We thought this is great. If we can have a fee that everybody pays, then you're going to have your impacts taken care of. So no one really will have to do an EIR just because of potential transportation impacts. You may have historic resources impacts or other impacts, but so we thought that a bunch of projects that would otherwise have had to do an EIR would now be doing NECDEX or potentially CADEXs. But then when we decoupled the fee from CEQA and we just did it under the Mitigation Fee Act, we lost that potential cost savings too. So part of the outreach that we had done was under those old assumptions too. So all these things I think converged.
And I'll just say 2 years and a few months into this, development projects in general, there's not a lot of time savings, I would say, for mid to small scale projects. Large scale projects, we're usually doing EIRs to their point anyway, so the EIR process just takes time in a litigious San Francisco environment. The biggest time savings, and I don't think this is stressed enough, is transportation projects. We, 2nd Street, just down here, we did an EIR for LOS. We would exempt that project in a matter of days now. We have done numerous safety projects that I know we're talking about development, but I think it's really critical as well.
So in Oakland, we adopted the fee when we were still under LOS, and so at that point, the developers were actually pushing for the fee because of this CEQA benefit. So we had cumulative impact mitigations that were huge without any kind of fair share program, and so you know, there was no rough proportionality. Huge cumulative impact, and we said, okay, developer, you're responsible for the entirety of it. We didn't get sued on that, but because developers just wanted the project approval. So developers were pushing for it with this anticipated cost savings. Under the new VMT paradigm, we haven't gone back to actually look at what the cost would be if the two scenarios. So are there cost savings? There might be, I think, as others have said, maybe some projects, maybe not. We haven't actually analyzed that. But there is certainly, I think, an overall streamlining to the development process, and that's something we're actually trying to measure now and track. And this is a piece of it. Another piece of it is just the tiering that we're doing from you know, higher level EIRs.
Could I just reiterate the El Cerrito example I passed over quickly? The San Pablo Area Specific Plan, which is basically where El Cerrito is going to grow, it's a major part of the city. They did all this active transportation planning as part of that plan. So tiering off of that EIR, they get all the streamlining from CEQA on the transportation side, because now they have a fee to pay for all the projects that were in the EIR that were analyzed as part of the whole development envelope. So that'll be a big benefit for that area of San Pablo.
I'm going to ask Andrea to add to this most probably, is that some developers are in the unfortunate situation in jurisdictions where that want to move towards this, right? That they have to do both. They have to do level of service and they have to do VMT analysis, and there is sometimes lack of clarity about how, you know, what are how they could be sued or whatever. So I thought it would be helpful to just talk about that for a second.
Well, I think OPR has been very clear, and the law is very clear that if the jurisdictions want to keep LOS as part of their good planning set of policies, whether in the general plan or elsewhere, that's totally okay. And with that, you can also keep fees, just like we can have fees under the police power more generally. You would have to justify them by keeping the same reasonable relationship that I talked about in the presentation. I do worry that if you have a fee under the Mitigation Fee Act and you have a fee elsewhere too for the same development, you may be getting close to the nexus or definitely the feasibility.
Yeah, I think what I would say, if you want to keep LOS, even in a CEQA approach, that's fine. Andrea's right. Don't layer the fees because you're talking about a single transportation nexus. Do use the asset-based approach. Come up with this maximum justified fee that's way in excess of what you're ever going to impose. Do all the planning over here, LOS, capital improvements, active transportation improvements, and then impose the single fee at a level to fund, net of other funding sources, that list of improvements. That's how you can merge the two.
Thank you very much. Since we are close to in overtime at this point, I want to thank all the panelists for being here and providing this great information for our event. And also, just so you know, we will have these presentations available on our website at MTC Planning Innovations. So they should be up in a week or so. We'll also have a video recording of the event, so look out for that. But you do have contact information for the panelists, and feel free, they've been open to being contacted and getting you information directly if that's possible. Lastly, I want to ensure that you see that the survey, if you filled it out, this is what Crew T's collecting around technical assistance. So if you still have that to give to Crew T before you leave, we'd appreciate that. And thanks again.
That was fun. That was great. You were great. It was interesting.
Yes.
It's always hard to think how to scale it back, right? Like I feel so fortunate that I live in New York City.
I know. I mean, I'm very sensitive to
If people wanted to do any of this,